And here we go.
Hi, everyone. Today marks the second of a three-part series called Unbagging the Biology of Bagworms. We're kicking things off with exploring learning standards pertaining to heredity and reproduction through today's presentation. What are bagworms and what does their life cycle look like? You'll be in the know shortly when we turn things over to our two scientists and bagworm experts, Tracy Leisenfeld, who will be leading the discussion, and Akito Kawahara. For all our attendees on the call today, you can use the chat feature to write any questions for our scientists, and we will be addressing those questions towards the end of today's presentation. So please keep the questions coming. Before turning things over to Tracy, we want to make sure that the teachers and schools know that you can have a scientist speak with your classroom at any time by visiting the Scientists in Every Florida School website. We're a free program with a mission to engage Florida K-12 teachers and students in cutting-edge research by providing science role models like today and experiences that we hope inspire you to be better future stewards of our planet. And this program is also made possible thanks to our wonderful scientist experts, Tracy Leisenfeld and Dr. Akito Kawahara, who are part of the McGuire Center for Lepidoptera, and of course, Alberto Lopez, Manager of Museum Education at the Florida Museum of Natural History. And we are Stephanie Killingsworth, your Education and Outreach Coordinator, and Lexi Bolger, Outreach Assistant for the Scientists in Every Florida School program. At this time, I'm going to turn things over to our scientists.
Alrighty. Hello, everyone. My name is Tracy Liesenfeld, and it's so great to have the opportunity to speak with you all today. Today, we're going to be discussing what are bagworms and what does their life cycle look like. This is part of an ongoing collaborative project between the Mung Lab and the Kawahara Lab here at UF, and I'm so excited to share more with you guys today. So, first, with how expansive this unique group of insects is, it does take a village to study them all, and I'm so grateful to have such a wonderful group of people to study them with. Here I have myself, as well as some other members of Dr. Andrew Mung's lab and Queen Christina, as well as some folks over at the Florida Museum, including Megan, Dr. Akito Kawahara, Paul, and David. Now, let's get into it. So we have here an image showing a wide range of Lepidoptera. Lepidoptera are an order of insects containing our moths and our butterflies. We can observe through this image alone that we see a wide range in our morphological or physical characteristics. Whether that be in body size, wing shape, coloration, or patterning, each insect is truly unique. Some of these insects even have physical features they can use to help prevent themselves from being predated upon, including eye spots like we can see on the far right. Each of these unique features helps contribute to a lot of diversity within Lepidoptera, but it's not unique to the adults alone, and we can actually see it in our larval groups. And this is part of where bagworm moths come into play. So, what exactly is a bagworm? At a first glance, it's hard to tell exactly what we're looking at, but if we look a little bit closer, we can actually see that there are some pairs of legs underneath these woody structures. These are examples of some of our larval caterpillar stages of our bagworm moths. As the caterpillar continues to grow, it utilizes materials found within its environment and contributes them to silk to create their bags, which will eventually become their cocoons that they metamorphosize in. These bags can take numerous appearances from looking like something like a pile of sticks, kind of like we see in figure E, to even looking like a pine cone structure like we see in figure F. Well, while we see there's a lot of diversity within our larval stages of bagworm moths, there's also a lot of variation within our adult bagworms. So we have here, once again, a wide range diversity. Some species have wings that look almost see-through, like our evergreen bagworm moth over here. But we can also see that others have a lot of unique patterning, spots, and stripes and coloration, making them a very unique, diverse group of insects. But what if I were to show you these images? Believe it or not, these are also bagworm moths. In females, the adult forms can look quite different from the males. We can see here in the middle, this female, she does have wings, but they're actually quite reduced to the ones I just showed you before. But on both her left and right, we can see that each of these adults don't even have any wings at all. And we can even see here, well, this one has some legs it could use. This one here doesn't have any. So they're all pretty different from those winged typical moths that we'd expect to see. Now, what exactly makes them unique? We can see they're quite unique in not just their larval forms, but the difference is present in adults. But how exactly does this compare to other Lepidopteran species? Well, let's take an example of a pretty familiar face. I'm sure most of you have heard of the monarch butterfly before. So in this system, this is the typical life cycle of what we expect to see within a monarch butterfly. An adult will lay her eggs onto the surface of a leaf, which once it hatches, the larval or the caterpillar emerges, and it will begin to feed and grow until it's ready to undergo metamorphosis. To do so, it will form its pupa and then emerge out as an adult and repeat this cycle all over again. Now, how does this differ to a bagworm moth? We can see that unlike our friend the monarch, we see some unique changes to this life cycle. And so the first being that rather than laying their eggs on a leaf, many will actually instead have their eggs inside that bag, in which the caterpillars will develop and hatch inside that case before it actually leaves those bags to then grow as a caterpillar. And so you can see on that far right, this is an example of cutting open the bag in half, and we can see that there's hundreds and hundreds of eggs within just that one bag alone. Now, what happens once they leave the bag? Once they leave the bag, they actually begin to produce their own bag. So in the caterpillar stage, these larvae are similarly focused on just being an eating machine and focusing a lot on growth. However, unlike the monarch, as the larval feeds, it also uses some of that plant material to continue to build onto this growing bag. There are structures composed of silk mixed with plants that they'll carry along their abdomen as they continue to move around their environment. And so, while typically we think of them just seeing those bag structures, if we look underneath, that looks quite typical of what we'd expect to see of a typical caterpillar. And you can see that that abdomen is holding onto that bag casing. Now, the next stage of the life cycle, it's time for larvae to undergo pupation. Unlike a monarch, rather than building the pupal case from scratch, our bagworms have been creating these pupal cases throughout its larval lifespan. So instead, they'll simply tie off the tops of those larval casings to enclose themselves inside. This is where we start to see a little bit more of the differences. So in this case here, we have an example of a male pupa and a female pupa, and we can see that they're a bit different from one another. One of the key features that we can see here is we can actually see a little pad of what will eventually become the wings in our male species, whereas in the females, we actually don't see that feature and it's quite absent. And so once they enclose, they'll basically turn themselves down, stick their head facing the bottom of the bag, and form this pupal case. Now, when we consider a typical metamorphosis, in a monarch, both our males and females will leave those pupal and become winged adults. But in our evergreen bagworm, only the males get to become winged adults. So once metamorphosis is complete, the males will emerge out of our pupal case, crawling out of the bag and fly off to find females to mate with. On the other hand, let's look at our female. She looks quite different from our males, as we can see, and so she lacks a lot of the typical characteristics we see in males, especially the wings. And so rather than her leaving the bag, she instead will stay within this bag where she'll wait for a male to come find her to mate with and then lay her eggs inside that bag. Now, let's look a little bit closer at some of those key differences in the features. So if we look here, we have an example again of one of our adult males and an adult female. And so our female much more caterpillar-like in comparison. We look at our males, there's a couple key features I want to point out. So we have our big plumose antennae. We also, of course, have our wings. And it's a little hard to see, but they also have quite large eyes. On the other hand, we look over at our female here. She's got very small eyes, very small residual legs. And one key feature of the females is they have this ovipositor. This is what allows them to lay their eggs. And we can see it's also surrounded by a patch of scales. The scales that kind of look similar to the scales we see along the body of the adult male. And so winglessness is the case for our evergreen bagworm, but if you remember from earlier, this isn't the case for all females. The female and male forms can vary a lot within this group of insects. And so you can see here on the top left, we have an example of a male and female pair in which both are winged. So both leave their bags, both can fly off, mate, complete their life cycle. But on the other hand, we have a couple later from those images I showed you earlier. We have the one with the reduced wings, which don't really fly, but we also have the ones that don't have any wings and do not fly. So this variation between the female form is highly diverse among this group of insects. Additionally, while bagworms are pretty prevalent to us as researchers, you actually might be more familiar with them than you think. So for any of my Pokemon fans out there, we have Burmy, which is the bagworm Pokemon. And so not only does Burmy have various bag cases based on its environment, kind of typical of what we see with the different forms of the larval stages like I showed earlier, but we can also see that its evolution reflects that of the female-male forms that we see in our evergreen bagworm. So if you look here, when Burmy is a male, Burmy evolves into Mothim, kind of like our moth species we see here of the evergreen bagworm. But when it's a female, it stays in that bag and makes it just basically bigger, kind of like we see with our evergreen bagworm females. And so, why did bagworms evolve to have such different females? Why would it not have wings? Well, one potential hypothesis is that maybe the bags are able to provide some sort of protection for the eggs, and perhaps the females evolved to not have wings so that way she's able to stay in that bag casing rather than leaving, so she could lay her eggs within there to help provide them protection from predation as other weather conditions as well. We don't really know for certain, but that's a large part of what we get to do as researchers. We're currently continuing to explore this group and looking at the differences in morphological characteristics or the physical characteristics between our males and females, as well as looking at genetic differences within these groups across this family of bagworm moths. And so, with that, I thank you all for listening. It's a little brief, but it's a nice little overview of our life cycle of bagworm moths.
Right, that's awesome, Tracy. Thank you so much. I have to say that you kind of blew my mind. I did not know so many of the things that you just talked to us today about the life cycle of backworms today. So super interesting. And I guess now is the part when you all, our audience here, gets to ask some questions to our scientists. And the great news is that we have Tracy, but we also have many other scientists here on the call to be able to answer your questions. So please feel free. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to enter those questions into the chat, and I will forward those questions for you to our scientists. Okay. So let's see if I already have some questions. And I actually have someone from Marnie's group wants to know, why are females so much smaller? Who would like to take that question?
I can take it, or if it's okay. And I just wanted to also mention that Christina Watkins is on the call, and Christina is a graduate student who just started here at the University of Florida, and she's really interested in bagworms. And I think if anyone of you have questions about bagworms, she can probably answer some of these as well. So the question is about bagworms and why are the females so small or smaller? And I think the answer to that has to do with the fact that the females always are in the bag, right? So they're not flying around, or they're just for the species that are that don't have wings, they're in the bag, so they can't really be big, right? If you're too big, you wouldn't fit in the bag. So you're kind of restricted to that space, and I think that probably had an impact on their body size.
Great. All right. I also have a
Christina, do you want to
question.
jump in?
Yeah, if I may.
Yeah, please.
So you're thinking about, in this case, the females being so much smaller than the males. And what are the females doing in comparison to the males? They're primarily laying these eggs. And so it makes more sense to them to put more energy into this reproduction, these laying of this egg stage, as opposed to something like bodily growth. So, like, if they can find a good ratio between they're a good size, they can hold all these eggs and they can use that energy, there's not really a reason for them to need to be much bigger.
Awesome. All right. I have another question here from Taisas and Cristina Quintero's group, and it's, how long can they live for?
Who wants to take this one? Should I take it?
Tracy's been rearing a lot of them. I guess your
Oh
mom
yeah,
did as
Tracy, you want
well.
to? Yeah, that's a good point. Tracy, you want to answer it?
Sure. So there's quite a bit of variation in how long they can live. A lot of bagworm species kind of go through an overwintering period before they actually emerge out as young little neonates or the juvenile stage. So a lot of times we start seeing a bit of those in the spring, and then they kind of spend the spring growing, and then around fall, around now is when we start to see the much larval stages, and they begin to tie themselves off into the bag. And then they take about another month or two before they emerge as an adult. As an adult, they don't live very long. And so they live maybe a week or so at max, from at least my experience rearing them. So not very long as an adult. They basically, main goal is to mate, reproduce, lay their eggs, and then let their life cycle continue on with their young.
Can I add something to this? So bagworms are pretty unusual in the Lepidoptera. We learned last time that Lepidoptera are butterflies and moths. I think you guys remember this maybe. But like monarch butterflies, for example, they have a life stage in which the caterpillar will live. Maybe a couple weeks, and then it becomes a cocoon or a pupa, and then it becomes an adult. These guys are pretty unusual in the sense that their development is pretty slow. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they live in a bag and they sometimes live in pretty harsh environments. The ones we see around here in Florida are not in a very harsh environment, but some of them that live in, deserts or other places have to deal with very dry conditions and things like that. So they hide in their bag and they kind of stay still for a long time. And in some cases, the development can last, a year or so. There's even a bagworm in Southeast Asia that is like a foot long. It's this massive, massive bagworm that lives in the trees, and it's like one of the rarest bagworms, but it's super cool. And it's thought to take over a year to develop to become an adult. So I think it varies a lot, but the environment that it lives in is really also very important, and it affects their development time.
That's great. All right, guys, keep those questions coming. I see lots of great questions. I have here another question here from Miss McCoy's. Let's see. One of her students asks, does the pupa need to stay attached to the leaf in order to grow properly?
I can take this one. So a lot of times in our lab, when we rear them, we're just kind of feeding them on just general plant material. So sometimes they'll attach themselves to the actual plant itself, but sometimes they'll also just attach themselves to like the cage. So they're actually not even on any plant material. You also might see some on the side of your houses. So they're not always on plants themselves. And we can also, like when we rear them in our lab, we kind of remove them and we'll put them in a separate cage and kind of take a small little pin to tie the top of their bag to the cage. Basically, the main thing is wanting to keep that orientation with the bag. So that way, when a male is emerging, they have to be able to emerge out the bottom of the bag. So we want to make sure that that bag is facing the correct way for them to leave the bag.
Great. All right. Let's see. I have another question here. How many eggs do the females lay at one time?
Yeah, so just in general, it's going to be, hundreds. When we open these bags, these cases, they're just packed full. Like, really, you cannot fit any more in them. I would imagine that it's species dependent. Maybe elaborating on what Akito said, like it maybe has to do with the size of the bag. It may even be individual specific within each species. I don't know that that's something that's been quantified or really looked at yet, so maybe that's something that we can do.
Yeah, that's great. And that's right. Christina's totally right that they lay hundreds of eggs. And this is just a side point, but there's other moths that also lay a lot of eggs. And I think in bagworms, I think it's something like 1,000 or 1,500 is the maximum number that somebody spent their time counting. But there's this moth called they're called ghost moths, and they're very common in Australia, and we have some here in Florida too. But they're these weird moths. They kind of look like, I don't know, they're just like they look like bats. In Japanese, they're called bat moths because they sort of look very strange. They kind of hang from like plants and stuff. But anyway, this moth flies around and it's well known to lay a lot of eggs. And there was one scientist a long time ago who I guess had a lot of time and had this female ghost moth and counted the number of eggs that the moth laid. And the total number was something around 15,000 eggs. And I think that somebody else tried to do this also, and it was somewhere close, like above that, somewhere around 20,000 or something. So one female moth, in some cases, can lay up to 20,000 eggs, which I think is absolutely incredible. Imagine all those caterpillars coming out and growing into, big moths. I mean, it would probably devastate all the trees and everything. But because we have predators, that doesn't happen. That's a very definitely on the higher end of producing lots of eggs.
That's very cool. And see, guys, you guys also have same questions that our scientists have, right? Is like that's a very awesome question, and then you start your research and you find out, and you have to count all those little eggs. So thank you for so much for that question. And actually related to this question, Miss Quintero's group wants to know how often do female lay eggs?
Typically for the females, they produce essentially one big large batch of eggs. So rather than being some species that will continue to lay eggs throughout their lifetimes, the bagworms basically, once they form their adult stage, their main goal is to lay all of their eggs, and that is pretty much their primary goal. So all those hundreds of eggs are all produced in like one time frame for that female.
That's awesome. I guess this one here is not too much of a question, but a cool little fun fact that we have here that Mrs. Hickman and Miss Allison's class wanted to share from I cannot pronounce Mayaka River found a bagworm on our campus after the first webinar. We have been watching her patiently, waiting to see what happens. So just wanted to share that with our scientists because I think that's pretty cool that after our first presentation, we had one of the groups find some bagworms. So I thought that would be nice to share. But again, Miss Hickman's and Allison's class also wanted to ask, what do bagworms eat and how do they eat?
So bagworms vary a whole lot in their diet. There are some species, like I kind of showed in the presentations, that the evergreen bagworm typically feeds on juniper, but they're also been recorded on various other species like willow and different trees. There are some species that are fungal feeders and will feed on fungus. So there's a wide variety. They're a bit more of a generalist, but they also can feed on lichens, moss. They have a wide range, but it varies a lot based on the species.
If
And
I
yeah, you can hop in. Sorry.
No, sorry. I was just going to elaborate on what you said, which is that some past work has pointed out that and we've seen this in the lab as well. I know Tracy with rearing has seen that even though species to species basis, they can eat a wide variety, individual to individual. Once they start on whatever plant matter they're eating, they really have a preference for that, and it can be difficult to move them over to other plant matter. So it's kind of like whatever you start eating, you continue eating. But what you start eating as a young bagworm can be pretty variable.
And I guess this next question is kind of related to that. Miss Bushnell's has a student that wants to know where do they mostly live?
I can take this one, I guess. Bagworms typically are found on trees or plants, so you'll find them kind of hanging off of things. So in the background images of the the panelists that are here, you can kind of see the bags kind of hanging off of this plant stem. The one that's behind me in my photo is a bagworm that's like kind of walking on the leaf surface. Um, so you'll find them on plants. Oftentimes they like to pupate, or the species around here, you can oftentimes find them like on the side of buildings or on railings. So they especially like wooden fences. So if you look on a wooden fence, underneath, sometimes you'll see these little tiny things hanging off of it. And look close, because oftentimes those are actually bagworms, and they're just pupating and waiting to come out.
Great. And do many of these trees and these places is it usually like the same plant that they consume later?
Yes, usually that's the case. Some of them wander around though a little bit, so you might find them not on the plant that they were eating, but they move away from the plant, and a lot of that has to do with predation. Like a lot of predators, like wasps and stuff and ants and things like that, that are looking for bagworms to eat. They're going to look on the plant that the bagworm's on, because that's where they're typically found. But when the bagworm is about to turn into a pupa or a cocoon, oftentimes they'll move away from the plant in order to kind of escape the potential predation. So if you wander around and go to a different plant, you're going to be, less. The chance of getting found is going to be lower. So some of them do wander around, others do stay on the plant. It kind of depends on the species.
All right, I think this question is probably Tracy wants to take this one here. It is, how long is a bagworm's life cycle?
Yeah, so typically most of the species that I have worked with have been roughly about a year. So typically the adults are kind of emerging around like late fall, kind of around now, or well, sorry, not late fall, it's early fall. So like around fall is like when we're starting to see the adults begin to emerge out. And so the adults will start to emerge out, lay their eggs, and then those eggs will overwinter. So basically during the winter's months, we're not going to really have much of those small little caterpillars emerging out yet. They'll begin to hatch around the springtime. And from spring, they're, like Akito said, they're very slow growing and developing. So they kind of start to feed, continue to build up their strength, build up those bags. And then late summer is kind of when they start to take their bags and tie them off and begin their pupation, where they pupate for roughly, from what I've noticed, maybe about a month. And then they'll begin to emerge as adults. So roughly about a year is their life cycle.
Great. And let's see, now this is a kind of general question about bagworms. So someone asks, what purpose do bagworms serve? Like, why are they important?
This is a great question. We get this question a lot, like, why do we do this as scientists? Why do we study, insects and things like bagworms? They're very kind of obscure. So one of the reasons we like bagworms and really interested in them is they produce a lot of silk. And so in order to make these cases that are really unique, they have to, the caterpillars have to produce silk to tie the wooden pieces together, right? And so they've actually evolved this amazing silk gland, which is this specialized like organ inside of its body that's way bigger than, like a monarch caterpillar silk gland or other, species of butterflies and moths that also have silk glands. And so something that's going on now is this research on silk, so we might be able to create some kind of material that's super strong and elastic from the silk that the bagworms create. And there's a lot of research going on in this field actually, and we're hoping to not only discover more species, but also connect it to silk that they and how we can use the silk for our benefit as well. So hopefully that answers a little bit of your question.
All right, and I have a little bit sort of related. Miss Hickman in Allison's class also asked, like, what happens if you move them off of your house or other areas, and is that white fuzz their silk?
Yes, it is their silk. That white fuzz. So sometimes when you have a bagworm and you kind of gently pull it off of something, it will you'll see this kind of like stringy, fuzzy stuff. It looks kind of like cotton. That is the silk, and it is very strong in some species. You can try to pull that stuff apart, but oftentimes it doesn't even rip because it's so strong. So how do they do that? We don't actually know. So something that Tracy, Christina's, and others, and Andrew Mong, who's not here unfortunately, but the, we're trying to understand what is the property, like how does that happen on a molecular level? Like, is it liquid initially, and how does it crystallize, and can we make something similar to that? So that's kind of like what I was just saying earlier, but I don't understand at all, and it's really exciting and intriguing when we make discovery.
All right. I also have here a question from Miss Collins' class that they are asking, where is the greatest population of bagworms found? I guess like maybe the most diverse place or where you could find the most bagworms. Let's see which scientist would like to take this question.
I can dig it unless somebody else wants to take this. So bagworms are found all over the world, but they're most common in the tropics, we think, but we don't really know. So one of the really cool things about bagworms is we really don't know anything about them. And we took this field trip recently to Costa Rica, and we were there for only about, like, I don't know, a week and a half or 2 weeks or something. But it was incredible, like the amount of bagworms we found and just the diversity, like these things we've never seen before. It turns out that one of the students that was on the call last time, David Chang, discovered this new subfamily. So it's this like, that doesn't really happen oftentimes in the scientific world, because it's a completely new group of bagworms. We discovered that it's not just found in Costa Rica, but probably all over the world. And these kinds of discoveries are pretty common in bagworms. So there's about, I think, 1,200 species described or 1,500 species described in the world. My guess is we don't know anything yet. So it's probably like 10,000 maybe. We have no idea. And every time we go out in the field, we find more things. I wouldn't be surprised if there's new species of bagworms found in Florida. There's just a lot we don't know.
That's very cool. There's a lot of work to do then, guys. That's pretty awesome. So Miss McCoy's a little bit related to that too, is like like in which environments can you find them? Like for example, can they be found in colder weather environments as well?
I can kind of answer that. So they're pretty widespread across different climates and environments. So, for instance, the evergreen bagworm, which is kind of the one I highlighted and what I talked about, a lot of those are primarily found more up north, kind of like near Michigan, Midwest, Northeast area. And so they're able to survive in those like colder environments due to kind of that overwintering that they do of their eggs. And so basically, they're not necessarily alive and moving around as much so much during that winter time, but that overwintering period for their eggs allows them to kind of pause until they hit spring when it starts to warm up again to be able to survive in those colder climates. But they're pretty widespread across a wide variety of environments and can handle some of those temperature ranges.
Awesome, thank you. All right, I have Miss Tish students want to know, do bagworms have venom or any other defense mechanism?
So I would argue that their bag is the best defense mechanism of all. If you're trying to avoid being eaten by something, or I have a little bit of a weird past. I worked with parasitoid wasps, which will try to find these little guys and parasitize them. It's pretty gnarly. But if you're trying to avoid that, if you're trying to mask your pheromones, if you're trying to blend into the environment, and even just provide a physical barrier, these bags are, I think, a really good route of doing that. And if I had to guess, I would imagine that's a big reason why they evolved this life history strategy.
Cool.
Yeah,
Oh,
can I just
Akito?
add one more thing? Yeah.
Yeah.
So Christina pointed out a really important thing, which is these wasps. These wasps and little flies and stuff, we oftentimes don't see them, but many of them are the biggest predators, they're called parasitoids, but they attack the caterpillars. And maybe you've seen this where you had a caterpillar or something, and then instead of the butterfly coming out, like something else, like a wasp comes out or something. And that kind of happens sometimes in nature. And if you have a butterfly caterpillar and that happens, it's kind of unfortunate, but it is part of nature, and that's how these organisms survive. So these wasps are very specialized, and oftentimes they only feed on one kind of caterpillar. And we think there's probably wasps that only prefer bagworms, but we don't really know. But as Christina mentioned, these, like this log house bagworm case that you can see behind me, we think that they make these as defenses, right? So wasps that might want to attack them won't be able to get in if you have a really tightly bound house. Ants probably can't eat them. Spiders probably won't be able to eat them, and so forth. So their best defense is what Christina mentioned, and it's the fact that they have a bag. And if they didn't have a bag, they would be completely open and probably get eaten right away.
All right, I have another great question here from Ms. Hickman's group wants to ask, um, how do you know if the bagworms are in their bag or if they have hatched? And I think it's maybe the question is like, how do you know if the bags have eggs in them and if those eggs have hatched?
So in terms of if they're still in the bag or not, so typically there's a very distinct way to tell if it's male or female based on this. So when a male leaves the bag, you'll actually see the remnants of the pupal casing hanging out from the like bottom of the bag. So it'll kind of look like this like crusty little brown kind of hatch type material. It looks like it's coming out of the bottom. And so if you see that, that's how you know that a male has already emerged out of that bag. For the females, it's a bit harder to tell if it's still being occupied per se. The females don't typically leave the bag, so it's hard to like really know. Usually it takes a while before those young juveniles begin to hatch and emerge out. So sometimes it just takes time of like keeping them in a little cage, keeping them in an environment before you actually start to know for sure if those eggs are ready to hatch or not. It's more so there's not like a clear sign like you would see with the males.
Awesome. And then I have another question here that I know Akito talked a little bit about this. Ms. Bushnell's student asked, are there any other natural predators of the bagworm? I know that Akito mentioned a lot of wasps, but I guess the question is, like, are there any other predators other than wasps?
Yeah, so just in general, I would say that though these parasitoid wasps tend to be very specialized, a majority of the insect world are kind of generalists. So if you have another insect that's walking by and they tend to be in that predator role in the ecosystem, they're probably going to be able to eat these bagworms. Again, jumping off of what Akito said, it would be more of a matter of can they get to them. And I actually don't know how much birds or other like larger mammalian predators get to them because of this blending into the environment. Maybe Akito or Tracy have a better idea of that.
Yeah, I'd say that I think, I mean, maybe small birds might be interested in them, but the amount of food that's in the bag is pretty small for a bird, right? And so, things that are walking around on the surface, like spiders. I don't know if you guys are familiar with jumping spiders, but jumping spiders are super cool. Like if you're really like I guess I'd just say that if you have a moment sometime, go outside and take a look around because there are these little tiny spiders called jumping spiders that have these really big eyes and they're visual hunters. So instead of a typical spider that will make a web, these guys are looking around for food. And whenever they see something move around, they try to catch it and eat it. If you're a bagworm and you're moving around with like a log house on your back, most likely the spider's not going to be able to get it because you'll be able to hide inside. So again, that's the defense. Um, I guess I love jumping spiders, so I'm just going to say this and just throw this in there. But these spiders are so cool. Like it's to the point where there's scientists now studying the way that the spiders can see, that they're developing these camera lenses and stuff and new optical lenses based on the spider's vision because they can see color and they have this amazing way of focusing on little things and stuff. So there's all this really interesting, cool research happening in the scientific world that comes from, insects and arthropods, spiders and stuff. It's just really fascinating world.
All right. I have another great question here is how many bagworms can live on one tree or plant, and could the amount of bagworms harm that tree or plant?
I think this is another case where it varies a lot by species. There are some areas where bagworms are considered pests, where if there's a high enough number, they can cause substantial damage to the trees. Because if you think about it, they're eating a lot of that leafy plant material. They're just like taking away at the tree, and they need those leaves to also be able to photosynthesize. And so if you are taking away most of those leaves because these caterpillars are eating it, those plants aren't going to be able to photosynthesize very well, which will cause damage to those trees. So it kind of varies a lot in terms of like the actual threshold and like the size of the bagworms. Like in Australia, there are some very big bagworm species where like the bag themselves can get to be like this big. And so something of that size can do substantially more damage than something really small. So there's a lot of variation, but they are pests in some areas due to their feeding habits.
All right.
Yeah. Uh,
Go ahead.
sorry, I'm going to say one more thing. There's actually a species in Southeast Asia that is known to be a pest, and it's a pest on on palms. And so the palm industry that we get oil from these palm like uh, uh, you know uh, vegetable oil and stuff like that. So these palms actually are affected by the bagworms, and it's turned into a little bit of a problem because there can be many of them in one place. But unless you have a ton of bagworms in one location, these insects are pretty small and they eat pretty slowly, so they don't have a huge impact on agriculture. At least we don't think, or we don't know.
All right. So I don't know if any of our scientists have tested this yet, but this is a very interesting question. It is, can bagworms swim?
Um, I think you're right. I don't know that anyone has tested this. I'm gonna guess no. But I'm actually gonna use this to talk about insects at large because insects are really weird. They don't have lungs, how we, purposely take air in and put it out. They instead passively breathe through these little holes in their skin. And so if that's blocked by something like the water, I'd imagine that just through their skin they can drown, which is really weird.
All
That's
right.
that's a great answer. Can I just add something?
Yeah.
I love this question. This is a fantastic question. They're all fantastic questions. Uh, so I wish David Chang was here because David has a side project where he's like looking at swimming caterpillars. There's actually some caterpillars, like butterfly larvae caterpillars, and some moths that actually can swim. They have they typically the ones that can swim typically live near water. So, here in Florida, we have springs, and there's a caterpillar that feeds on lilies that are found near the water. And when the water rises, the caterpillar actually has to get to the bank because it has to make a pupa in the soil, but it can't get there if it's all full of water. So it's evolved this ability to swim across the water, and it has this amazing ability to just kind of like swim like a little snake, and it just can manage to get to the riverbank. Other caterpillars do not. They simply will hit the water and they just sink to the bottom. So that's really sad. But there was actually a scientist who was very curious about this and did a little experiment where he had a bunch of caterpillars and he would like put them in water and see what would happen. It's a little bit sad because a lot of them would drown, but some of them did survive. And the ones that are hairy, like the woolly bear caterpillars, they actually can float because the air gets trapped in between the little hairs. And so we now think that that might actually have another purpose. It's not just this hairiness to protect against maybe predators, but maybe it actually protects them in this like wet habitat where if they fall off of a tree and land in water or something, they can float and survive. So this area of swimming in caterpillars is not known. We don't know anything about. I don't know about bagworms. Nobody's tried it with bagworms. Who knows?
That's awesome. See, guys, I mean, you guys are thinking like scientists here. You're having lots of these same questions, and we don't know the answers to all of them. So that's pretty awesome. Okay, so to wrap up, I have this really nice question from the Miami Lakes K-8 Center who asks, when did you know what you wanted to be a scientist and specialize in insects? And I guess all of our scientists could talk a little bit to this question, I guess. So let's see, who wants to start?
I can go ahead and start. I think for me personally, I've always wanted to be in science. I didn't really know I would be studying insects one day. I've just always been fascinated by kind of the natural world, the way like everything interacts with one another in its environment. And I've just always kind of been broadly interested in that. I actually originally was studying more mammals, and I just happened to get a summer job where I was working in agriculture and getting to see insects and the impacts that they can have on our environment and such of our food sources. And so from working from there, I got really interested in being able to like look at bugs more broadly and just kind of studying insects from more of a molecular perspective, which is what I do currently. But it was also really cool to kind of go out in the field and see the actual impacts that they have. And that's kind of how I ended up in entomology.
Yeah, so I'll take over next, I suppose. But my answer is I really didn't know for a very long time. I always thought that nature was cool and, bugs were neat. They were just kind of there. But I was much more interested in humans and what humans were up to. And so I was going to actually pursue becoming a medical doctor until I needed one more class in college, and the only one available was entomology. And I realized that insects were really everywhere, that like they're mining in leaves, they're underground, like deep, deep underground. They're just all around us. And that was really fascinating to me, just how they are able to fill so many different roles in the environment and really kind of go along their day without us even noticing them a lot of the time. So I really did a big 180 there and immediately just pursued studying insects and sort of that route of science as opposed to the human body.
All right, that leaves you, Akito.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just say that when I was really little, maybe 4 or 5 years old, my mom has told the story where apparently I really hated insects. I was definitely scared of them. I'd run away from them, and my father said, "This is not a good idea. You know, he needs to like Keto needs to be able to be in touch with nature a little bit better." So my dad bought me a butterfly net, and that was kind of the beginning of this journey to become an entomologist. And I just started to really appreciate this. Just, you know, they're just incredible. Like you start looking at the insects and they just do everything. And so I just got really, really interested in insects and just kind of started to go from there. I bought a couple books and stuff, and and what happened then was I did a little internship at the museum where I was growing up in New York City. And that was when I realized that there's all these incredible scientists and collections and all this stuff that happens in you can actually get a whole career to become an entomologist. And I had no idea. I thought it was just, collecting bugs or, taking pictures or something like that. But no, there's actually a real career in this. And it's wonderful. Like I love my job. It's a truly amazing job to be able to do what you love to do and go out in the field and look for bugs. And I never thought I could do this, but learning that those opportunities exist really, really helped me a lot. And so for those of you that are out there who might be interested, we're here to help. Like all of us, work at University of Florida and we have public programs, Alberto and others here are all involved in this. And if you're interested to come visit, I know we're closed right at the moment, but we will open up again next year. And we also have lots of programs that are going on locally, like we have pop-up tents and things like that. Yeah, the entomology department where Tracy and Christina are is open. You can come and I'm sure it's okay to probably check out their lab and things like that. So if you're interested, reach out to us because I became an entomologist because there were scientists that helped me, and I think we all share the same belief that we want to do the same for the next generation. So if you're interested in bugs, they are truly amazing. And just come by and let us know.
All right. Thank you. And thank you all to all of you for our audience here for all these amazing questions. As you see and heard, you had so many great questions, things that our scientists are still even trying to figure out to this day. So keep those questions coming. Maybe you can be the next scientist that finds the answers to these questions. So anyways, I'd like to turn things over back to Lexi and she'll wrap things up for us.
Thanks so much, Alberto. And we also want to thank everyone for joining us today and hope to see you for our final installment in the Unbagging the Biology of Bagworm series. We'll be touching on diversity and evolution of living organism standards on November 4th when we do a live Bagworm BioBlitz event. And you can also learn more as well as register for the events on the Scientists in Every Florida School website. And a recording of today's live stream will also be made available on the Tessie YouTube channel. So thank you so much again for hanging out with us today and to our partners. And see you next time. Bye, everybody.